In the current 3D software marketplace, each main package has a procedural workflow to one extent or another. Underlying each system, be it 3ds Max, Maya, XSI or Houdini, is what is known as a node-based architecture. But what exactly does this mean? Well, most objects in 3D are made up of subcomponents that handle certain aspects of that object's appearance and functionality. Each scene object is in effect a little machine, and the subcomponents that make up that machine are known as nodes or scene nodes. For instance, let's have a look at a simple scene object. A piece of scene geometry like a box or a model of a tree always has a transformation element to it. This defines where in space it actually sits, and what its orientation is, and so on. This transformation node is often the most basic node that is defined for any 3D software. Also, due to its very fundamental nature, often other fundamental values are contained within this node. For instance, the object's name, maybe its wire color, and so on. Now that we've defined a transform for our object in space, we now need to define what it's actually there at that point. This is defined by a geometry node, i.e. is it a NURB surface, or a patch, an editable poly, an editable mesh, or maybe a spline. Also, it could be a helper or a space warp, and so on. So as we can see, at this point our object is made up of two fundamental scene nodes, the transform and the geometry node. Now, if we wish to further modify this object, we could apply further nodes to it to modify its existing state in some way. As you can see, this is where the term node-based architecture comes in, and it's the chaining together of these nodes in a distinct procedural order that gives us what we call a procedural workflow. Quite simply, a procedural workflow is one where we can see the steps or procedures that make up our objects, and where we can go in and modify those steps in some way to change the end and outcome of that object in some way. The great advantage with a procedurally built object is that it's dynamic. It can respond and change to conditions in your scene, or it can be modified in some way by the end user. The disadvantage is that the object can in some cases take up more memory, though not always, and of course it can take a little more time to actually set up. Another downside is that one of the steps that makes the object could actually introduce a bug or a system slowdown in some way. Because of this, it's sometimes necessary, or at least desirable, to break the object down into a simple static basic object. On this DVD we'll show you how and where that is the case. At this point, let's have a look at two basic nodes in action, the transform and the geo node, by creating a scene element. In this case it'll be a teapot primitive. So in 3ds Max, the first thing we have to do is we have to tell the software that we intend to create a node. So I've gone up to the command panel and I've got it on geometry at the moment, and here we have these basic object types, primitives, and I'm going to actually click on the teapot. This actually tells 3ds Max that I want to actually create a teapot at this point. You can see it's got some basic parameters set up for us here. We've got the radius, which is set to 0, and we've got segmentation set to 4. You can see that at this point there's actually nothing shown in the viewport, and that's because at this point we actually haven't got a transform node set up. So we do that by actually using the user interface. So I'm going to set its position by clicking here on the grid, and by dragging I'm actually defining its radius value, which you can actually see in the command panel on the right hand side. So as I move up and down, you can see the radius value is actually being defined. When I leave go, that's actually defined the radius value for the object, and now we have a complete scene object. Now at this point its transform node is defined, and also its object type is defined here. So if I'll do that again, I'll just create another node and I'll click here, and you can see straight away it's actually defining the transform, and I'm specifying what the radius size is, and I leave go and that object is actually created at that point. So at this point you can see that we have created two basic scene objects, and as we discussed, they are made up of a transform and a geo node, which in this case is actually a primitive teapot, which you can actually see here in the viewport. Now we can actually change these primitive objects. If I go to the modifier panel, you can see that the parameters for these objects are still here. They're still available to be changed.